The Andes form a continuous wall along the western edge of South America, extending for more than 7,000 kilometers. In certain sections, the range rises abruptly, with peaks exceeding 6,000 meters. Snow remains on the upper slopes throughout the year. Wind moves across the ridges with little resistance. Temperatures shift quickly, especially at altitude, where the air holds less warmth. In October, late spring in the southern hemisphere, the mountains do not soften. Snowfields remain intact. Ice persists along the higher passes. The sky can appear clear for long periods, but conditions change without warning. Clouds form rapidly. Visibility narrows. Storms arrive with little indication from below. Between Argentina and Chile, the central Andes are defined by steep valleys and high plateaus. There are few roads at elevation. Outside of established routes, the terrain becomes difficult to cross. Rock, ice, and snow create a surface that offers little stability. Movement is slow, even for those prepared. At high altitude, the body reacts differently. Breathing becomes shallow. Fatigue appears quickly. Dehydration develops without immediate awareness. For those unacclimatized, the environment imposes limits that are not always understood in advance. From a distance, the mountains appear still. There is no visible motion across their surface. No indication of scale. The silence, when present, is uninterrupted. It does not suggest danger. It does not suggest safety. It remains constant. On October 12, 1972, a Fairchild FH-227D aircraft operated by the Uruguayan Air Force departed from Montevideo, Uruguay. The flight was chartered to carry members of the Old Christians Club rugby team to Santiago, Chile, where they were scheduled to play a match. Alongside the players were friends, relatives, and a small number of additional passengers. In total, 45 people were on board, including the crew. Most of the passengers were young. Many were in their late teens or early 20s. They were students, athletes, and recent graduates. Their experience with the Andes Mountains was limited. For most, this was a routine journey across a familiar region, made more common by air travel. The aircraft itself was not large. It had been used regularly by the Uruguayan Air Force and was considered reliable for regional flights. The route from Montevideo to Santiago required crossing the Andes, a passage that depended heavily on weather conditions. Flights over the mountains were often adjusted or delayed when visibility declined. On this occasion, poor weather over the Andes forced the aircraft to stop overnight in Mendoza, Argentina. The delay was not unusual. Flights across the range frequently required patience. The passengers remained in Mendoza until conditions were judged suitable to continue. On October 13, the flight resumed. The aircraft departed Mendoza in the early afternoon. The plan was to cross the Andes and descend into Santiago from the west. Due to cloud cover, the pilots relied on instrument navigation rather than visual confirmation of their position. At the time, navigation over the Andes required careful estimation. Aircraft often followed established corridors, using timing and heading calculations to determine when they had cleared the highest peaks. Errors in estimation could place an aircraft closer to terrain than intended. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere remained informal. Passengers spoke with one another, moved about, and treated the journey as routine. There was no indication from within the aircraft that the conditions outside were changing in a way that would affect the outcome of the flight. The Andes remained ahead, obscured by cloud. After departing Mendoza on October 13, 1972, the aircraft turned west toward the Andes. The flight path required a gradual climb to clear the mountain range, followed by a descent into Santiago. Cloud cover remained present across much of the route, limiting visibility outside the cockpit. Under these conditions, the pilots relied on instrument readings and time-based navigation. This method required estimating position based on speed, heading, and elapsed time. In clear weather, visual reference points would confirm location. On this flight, those references were largely unavailable. As the aircraft moved deeper into the mountains, air currents became less stable. The Andes create irregular wind patterns, particularly along ridges and valleys. These shifts can affect speed and altitude, introducing small variations that accumulate over distance. Even minor deviations, if uncorrected, can alter the estimated position of an aircraft. At a certain point in the flight, the crew believed they had crossed the highest section of the Andes. Based on their calculations, they requested permission from air traffic control in Santiago to begin descent. Clearance was granted. The aircraft began to lose altitude while still within cloud. Outside the cockpit, the terrain remained unseen. The mountains ahead were not visible. The descent continued under the assumption that the aircraft had already passed beyond the most dangerous elevations. In reality, the aircraft had not yet cleared the range. As it descended, the margin between the aircraft and the terrain reduced. The mountains rose beneath the cloud layer, unseen from above. The crew continued their approach based on their calculated position. Moments later, the aircraft encountered strong turbulence. The change was abrupt. The airframe began to shake. The pilots increased power in response, attempting to stabilize the aircraft and regain altitude. Through a break in the cloud, terrain became briefly visible. Snow-covered peaks appeared close to the aircraft's path. The distance between the aircraft and the mountains was shorter than expected. The pilots reacted immediately, but the available time was limited. The aircraft continued forward into the range. The aircraft struck the Andes in the afternoon of October 13, 1972. The initial contact occurred when the right wing clipped a mountain ridge. The force of the impact tore the wing from the fuselage. Moments later, the left wing detached as well. With both wings gone, the aircraft lost lift and control. The tail section separated shortly after, exposing the rear of the cabin. The remaining fuselage continued forward, sliding along the slope. It descended rapidly over snow and ice, carrying those still inside. The interior was exposed to freezing air. Seats were dislodged. Loose objects moved through the cabin with force. The fuselage eventually came to a stop on a snow-covered incline at an altitude of approximately 3,600 meters. The movement ended without further descent. Of the 45 people on board, several died on impact. Others sustained severe injuries. Survivors remained inside or near the fuselage, disoriented and exposed to the cold. The environment was immediately present. Wind moved across the open structure. Temperatures were below freezing. Snow surrounded the crash site in all directions. The terrain extended upward toward higher peaks and downward into steep, inaccessible valleys. In the minutes following the crash, survivors began to assess their condition and the condition of others. Some attempted to move the injured into the remaining fuselage for shelter. The structure, though damaged, provided partial protection from the wind. There was no immediate understanding of their exact location. Visibility remained limited. The surrounding mountains appeared uniform, without clear landmarks. Communication with the outside world was not established. The aircraft's radio equipment was damaged and could not be operated by the passengers. As daylight began to fade, the temperature dropped further. The realization developed gradually. They were alive, but isolated, at high altitude, with limited supplies and no clear path out. By the evening of October 13, the survivors had gathered within the remaining fuselage. The structure, though damaged, offered partial enclosure against the wind. The open rear section was exposed, where the tail had separated. Cold air moved freely through this gap. Efforts began to make the interior more stable. Luggage, seat cushions, and fragments of the aircraft were used to block openings. These materials did not seal the fuselage, but they reduced direct exposure. Snow remained packed around the exterior, forming a barrier along the lower edges. Inside, space was limited. Survivors positioned themselves close together to conserve warmth. Many were injured. Fractures, head trauma, and internal injuries were present. Movement was restricted. Those able to assist others began organizing the available space. Among the survivors were individuals with basic medical knowledge. One of them, Roberto Canessa, was a medical student. Another, Gustavo Zerbino, had similar training. Their experience was limited, but they began assessing injuries and prioritizing care using what resources were available. Supplies were minimal. Food recovered from the wreckage included small quantities of chocolate, wine, and snack items. There was no structured reserve. Rationing began early, though the scale of the shortage was not yet fully understood. Water was not immediately accessible in liquid form. Snow surrounded the site, but consuming it directly lowered body temperature. The group began using pieces of metal and other materials to melt snow during daylight, relying on sunlight to produce small amounts of water. During the first night, temperatures dropped significantly. Without insulation or proper clothing, exposure became a primary concern. Some survivors died during this period from injuries sustained in the crash. Others weakened due to the cold. By the following day, the group had established a basic structure. The fuselage served as shelter. Roles began to emerge informally. Those able to move collected materials. Others remained inside, conserving energy. There was no clear timeline for rescue. The assumption remained that search efforts would begin. The group focused on maintaining the shelter and preserving what remained of their physical condition. In the days following the crash, the survivors took inventory of what remained. The food recovered from the aircraft was limited to small items, chocolate bars, a few bottles of wine, and packaged snacks. There was no expectation that these supplies would last for an extended period. Rationing began immediately. Portions were reduced to the smallest possible amounts. Each person received only a fragment per day. The intention was to extend the supply for as long as possible, though no one knew how long that would be. Water remained a daily concern. Snow was abundant, but it could not be consumed directly without increasing the risk of hypothermia. The group developed a method of melting snow using pieces of metal placed in sunlight. Small quantities of water were produced this way, though it required time and favorable weather. The interior of the fuselage became organized around routine. Those who could move gathered materials during daylight. Others remained inside, conserving heat. Injured survivors required constant attention. Movement was slow, and energy was limited. At night, temperatures dropped further. The group remained close together, using shared body heat to reduce exposure. Sleep was irregular. Discomfort and cold interrupted rest. Several days after the crash, some survivors located a small transistor radio among the wreckage. Through it, they learned that search operations had begun. Aircraft were scanning the Andes, looking for signs of the missing flight. The group attempted to make themselves visible. They arranged debris on the snow and watched the sky for passing aircraft. On multiple occasions, planes flew overhead. None altered course. The white fuselage against the snow was difficult to distinguish from the surrounding terrain. Time became difficult to measure. Days were marked by light and darkness rather than dates. The expectation of rescue remained, but it began to stretch beyond immediate reach. The available food supply continued to decline. On the night of October 29, 1972, more than 2 weeks after the crash, conditions changed without warning. Snow had accumulated around the fuselage in the days prior. The surrounding slopes, already unstable, held layers that had not yet settled. During the night, a mass of snow broke free above the crash site and moved downward. The avalanche struck the fuselage directly. Snow forced its way through the open rear section, filling the interior space. Those inside had little time to react. The force displaced bodies and compressed the confined area. Several survivors were buried immediately. The interior became dark and compact. Movement was restricted. Breathing became difficult for those trapped beneath the snow. Others, positioned closer to the front, remained partially above the accumulation and began attempting to clear space. Efforts to dig out those buried began at once, using hands and fragments of material. The work was slow. The density of the snow limited progress. Some survivors were located and pulled free. Others could not be reached in time. 8 people died as a result of the avalanche. The fuselage, already damaged, became further enclosed by snow. The rear opening, which had previously allowed airflow, was now blocked. While this reduced exposure to wind, it also limited ventilation. The interior environment changed. Air became more difficult to circulate. In the days that followed, survivors worked to create a passage through the snow to the outside. A small tunnel was eventually opened, allowing limited movement in and out of the fuselage. Light returned gradually through this opening. The event altered the structure of the group. Fewer people remained. Injuries increased. Physical strength declined further. The expectation of external rescue continued, but the passage of time and repeated setbacks began to change how it was considered. The environment remained unchanged. Snow, altitude, and isolation continued without variation. In the weeks following the avalanche, the survivors settled into a pattern of adaptation. Each day involved small, methodical actions to maintain life. The fuselage remained their primary shelter, its interior arranged to conserve warmth and accommodate the injured. Snow and ice surrounded the structure, persistent and unyielding. Water was obtained by melting snow, using sunlight on fragments of metal and other materials. The process produced only small quantities, requiring careful distribution. Those capable of movement handled this task, while the weakest remained inside, conserving energy. Food remained scarce. Chocolate and small provisions had been consumed within the first week. Wine, carried initially as a beverage, served as both liquid and occasional energy source. As supplies dwindled, the survivors confronted the limits of what the human body could endure without proper nutrition. Weakness became routine. Movement slowed. Hands and feet were often numb from the cold. Improvised tools were fashioned from aircraft debris. Pieces of metal were shaped into cutting implements. Clothing was layered and modified to increase insulation. Shelter was reinforced with luggage and seat cushions, and snow was compacted around the fuselage walls for additional protection. Physical challenges were accompanied by mental ones. Days became measured by small tasks: water collection, clearing snow, assisting the injured, maintaining the fuselage. Time passed without clear markers. Light and darkness defined it, but days blended together. Survivors remained observant of external conditions. Occasionally, cloud cover would clear, revealing distant peaks. Aircraft were occasionally seen in the distance, though none altered course toward them. These glimpses reinforced isolation. By necessity, routine replaced spontaneity. Roles were informally assigned. Those able to move handled external tasks. The injured were monitored and repositioned. Each action was deliberate, informed by the constraints of the environment. Over time, the group's capacity for endurance became apparent. Though weakened, they adjusted to the cold, limited food, and altitude. Survival was sustained through methodical, repeated action, rather than luck or intervention. By late November, the survivors had exhausted all remaining conventional food supplies. Small portions of chocolate and wine were gone. Leaves and other natural vegetation were scarce and largely indigestible. Physical weakness was widespread. Injuries persisted, and some had become infected. Faced with this reality, the group confronted a decision they had previously avoided. Without sustenance, continued survival was impossible. The deceased remained inside the fuselage, preserved in the cold and snow. Over time, it became clear that using these bodies as a food source would be the only means to survive. This action was considered quietly and collectively. There was no dramatization or ceremony. It was a practical assessment of the situation. The group established minimal procedures to consume portions, carefully distributing resources among the living. The act allowed the survivors to maintain a measurable intake of protein and calories. Consumption occurred under strict necessity. Portions were small. Each day involved careful consideration of who required more energy to maintain mobility and assist others. The practice continued intermittently, dictated entirely by the scarcity of other options. Alongside this, the survivors maintained routines for warmth, water collection, and shelter reinforcement. They continued to monitor external conditions, hoping for signs of rescue. Their physical and mental energy was directed toward tasks that offered tangible support to survival, rather than dwelling on the implications of their choices. The decision was a quiet acknowledgement of reality. It was not a response to panic, but to necessity. Daily life continued in its structured form, shaped by routine, weather, and the limits imposed by the environment. As days turned into weeks, several survivors attempted to leave the crash site in search of help. Initial efforts were cautious and limited. The surrounding terrain was steep, covered in deep snow and ice. The altitude, exceeding 3,500 meters, made physical exertion difficult. Small groups ventured a few hundred meters from the fuselage. They carried minimal supplies, fragments of clothing, small amounts of food, and makeshift tools. Their intent was to identify a viable route toward inhabited areas or lower elevations. Each excursion was measured and deliberate. These early journeys highlighted the difficulty of movement in the Andes. Steep slopes ended abruptly in cliffs or crevasses. Snow and ice concealed the stability of the ground. Efforts to descend required constant reassessment. Paths chosen often became impassable, forcing the groups to return to the fuselage. Each attempt exhausted those involved. Weakness from prolonged hunger, injury, and cold limited distance traveled. Misjudgments in direction occurred because visibility was inconsistent and landmarks were obscured by snow and cloud. The survivors quickly recognized the limitations of leaving in small groups without adequate preparation. Time spent outside often led to fatigue, frostbite, and additional risk of injury. Groups returned to the fuselage with new knowledge of the terrain but without progress toward rescue. These failed expeditions shifted the group's perspective. The crash site remained the primary location for survival. Shelter, water, and coordination were concentrated there. The decision to remain was practical, dictated by the difficulty of traversing the environment under their physical constraints. The fuselage became the central point of both refuge and planning. The external landscape remained harsh and unyielding, a reminder of the challenges any escape would entail. By mid-December, 2 survivors, Nando Parrado and Roberto Canessa, began preparations for a longer journey across the Andes. The decision to leave the fuselage was informed by repeated observation of the terrain and knowledge that rescue had not yet arrived. The objective was to reach lower elevations where inhabited areas might exist. Preparation involved minimal supplies. Fragments of clothing were layered to preserve warmth. Small amounts of chocolate and wine were carried. Tools improvised from wreckage, pieces of metal and wood, were brought along for cutting and support. The 2 men departed quietly, leaving a note within the fuselage detailing their intended route. The first hours involved careful navigation. The snow-covered slopes were uneven, and hidden crevasses presented constant risk. Each step required assessment of stability. Progress was slow, measured in hundreds of meters rather than kilometers. Altitude continued to affect breathing and endurance. The route required descending toward lower passes while simultaneously moving laterally along the mountain range. Visibility was limited by intermittent clouds and drifting snow. The pair paused periodically to rest, melt snow for water, and consume small portions of food. Weakness and frostbite were persistent concerns. Over the course of several days, Parrado and Canessa maintained a deliberate pace. They used high points to survey potential paths and identify signs of human presence. Their movement was disciplined, guided by observation rather than speculation. Occasionally, they encountered terrain that forced them to retrace steps, climb back over ridges, or navigate around impassable sections. Despite the difficulty, they continued westward. On the 9th day of their journey, the pair reached a lower slope and observed signs of vegetation and animal tracks, indications of proximity to inhabited areas. This marked the first tangible evidence of human activity since the crash. The Andes remained imposing, but the gradient of risk had shifted. Survival depended not on waiting, but on measured, continuous action. Their movement was informed by prior experience, observation of the environment, and careful management of remaining energy and resources. On December 20, 1972, after several days of traversing the Andes, Nando Parrado and Roberto Canessa encountered a Chilean arriero, Sergio Catalan, on the western slopes of the mountains. Catalan was tending livestock in a remote area near the village of Los Maidens. The two survivors communicated their situation using basic gestures and Spanish words. Catalan recognized the urgency and retrieved a pen and paper. Parrado wrote a note explaining that there were survivors at the crash site, specifying the approximate number and condition. Catalan carried the message to the nearest authorities. He traveled on horseback to alert local police and emergency services. The route he took involved steep paths and difficult terrain, but it was navigable for a rider. Within hours, Chilean authorities organized a rescue operation. Helicopters and search teams were dispatched toward the coordinates provided. The approach to the crash site required careful navigation over high passes and snow-covered slopes. By the following day, December 22, rescuers reached the fuselage. They located the remaining 14 survivors, bringing them out of the mountains. Each survivor was weak, suffering from frostbite, dehydration, and malnutrition, but alive. Medical attention was administered immediately. Transport to medical facilities followed, beginning the process of recovery. The event concluded in a quiet manner. The mountains remained unchanged, indifferent to the human activity within them. Rescue was effective but restrained. There was no public spectacle at the site. Survivors were removed methodically, with attention to medical need and safety. The Andes had claimed lives, but the remaining group was now secured. Following the rescue, survivors were transported to hospitals in Santiago, where medical teams treated injuries, frostbite, and the effects of prolonged starvation. Recovery was gradual. Physical strength returned slowly, and some injuries left lasting effects. The crash and its aftermath were documented extensively. Investigators recorded flight data, weather conditions, and navigation errors. The precise cause of the accident was attributed to a combination of cloud-obscured terrain, miscalculation of position, and descent prior to clearing the mountains. The lessons informed aviation safety procedures for future flights over the Andes. For the survivors, the experience remained a quiet, persistent presence. They had endured extreme isolation, cold, and hunger. Their survival depended on observation, careful routine, and disciplined action, rather than chance alone. The event became a subject of historical record. Analyses focused on human endurance, decision-making under extreme conditions, and the physical demands of high-altitude survival. It stands as a documented example of prolonged isolation in an environment that offers no concessions. The Andes themselves remained unchanged. Snow and ice continued over the slopes. The silence, wind, and altitude persisted, indifferent to the human lives once concentrated on their surface. The story concludes with observation. Survival was measured, deliberate, and factual. The mountains, as they had been before, remain.